Okay, so we are just looking at the top part of page 10 on your notes, and it asks, can we take a root of a negative number? So first we have radical negative 9. So we're trying to figure out if we can take the square root of negative 9. So let's think about what this means. Again, if we think about our question, this means what number times itself equals negative 9. So let's just think about what this might be. So we're thinking, okay, well, 3 times 3, we know that's positive 9. So that is not going to help us. Well, what about negative 3? Negative 3 times negative 3. There are some negatives. But then we think back to our multiplication rules with negatives, and we remember that a negative times a negative is also a positive. So that's not going to help us get to negative 9. So we usually in class, we're kind of talking about this. So, let people talk it over, talk with a partner about it. And someone might remember, okay, well, the only way to get a negative answer is to have two numbers with different signs, which is true. This is a true statement. Negative 3 times 3 does equal negative 9. But it doesn't really help us in this case because I want a number times itself. And 3 and negative 3 are very different numbers. So this doesn't help either because it's not something squared, right? Squared means times itself. This is two different numbers. So we come to the conclusion that there is no way to take the square root of negative 9, because to get the negative, my numbers would have to have two different signs, and then they're not the same number. So we say for this one that there's no solution in the real numbers. Okay, so we talked about number sets earlier in the semester, and we said that basically every number you can think of is a real number. Positives, negatives, zero, decimals, fractions, rational, irrational, things like pi that go on forever, okay? And there is a separate group of numbers called imaginary numbers, and that takes care of negatives under the radical. We're not going to look at those now. Math 120, you'll get to those. So for now, when we're just talking about the real numbers, we cannot take the square root of a negative number. Okay, well, let's think about the next one. We have the cube root of negative 8. So again, this is saying what number times itself 3 times equals negative 8. Well, when we think back to, okay, what's this cube root of 8? That was 2, because 2 times 2 times 2 equals 8. So usually in class, when we're doing this with the whole class, people kind of remember that cube root of 8 is 2. It's kind of one of the first cubes that you might really get comfortable with. So someone realizes that this actually does have an answer. If I take negative 2 and multiply it by itself 3 times, negative 2 times negative 2 is positive 4. 4 times negative 2 is going to be negative 8. So this one does have an answer. I can take the cube root of negative 8. So then we talk about what's the rule about taking the root of a negative number. How come this one has no solution and this one does have a solution? And sort of what's the general rule about that? And it's a little tricky here because we can't really, interact and talk about it. But if you think about it for a few minutes, think about what's happening here, right? In this case, I want to know a number that multiplies by itself to be this number. In this case, I want to know a number that multiplies by itself 3 times to get this. And that's the key, okay, is how many times it is. So I'm going to write out the rule and then we'll talk about it. So the rule is this. We can take the root of a negative number take the root of a negative number if the index, right? The index is over here and it tells us how many times we're multiplying that thing. If the index is odd, but not if the index is even. Okay, so we can take the root of a negative number if the index is odd, but not if the index is even. So what does that have to do with anything, odd and even? Well, let's think about a different situation for a minute. You're in class, and I ask you to get in groups of 2, into pairs, to do an activity, and there are 9 people in the class. Okay, think about what happens. Right, you get into pairs, and then there's one person that is not in a pair. You might have a group of 3, but if I say just pairs, there's going to be one person that's not in a pair. But what if there are 8 people in the class? Well, then you can pair them up, okay? Or if there are 10 people, or if there are 16 people, or if there are 28 people, right? All of those are even numbers, so they pair up. That's the definition of an even number, is that it's something divisible by 2. It can be put into groups of 2. An odd number is always going to be a bunch of groups of 2 and then one left over. Okay, because here's my even number, the next number is odd, right? Kind of like we talked about with the consecutives, if you think about that. Here's my even, next number's odd, it's by itself. Next number's even, pairs up again. Next number's odd, right? So that's kind of where the odd and even come in. But why does it matter here? Well, what happens when I have a pair of negative numbers? Every time I have 2 negatives that I'm multiplying, they come together to make a positive. So if I have an even index, an even number of times that I'm going to be multiplying that negative number by itself, so let's kind of write it this way, okay? So I have, these are all negative signs. I'm multiplying all these together. So these 2 make a positive, 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 positive. I'm multiplying all positives together. My answer is always going to be positive. So if I'm multiplying something an even number of times, I have an even index, I can never end up with an even answer. But if I'm multiplying these an odd number of times, even positive, 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 positive times a negative is going to give me a negative. So if it's an odd number of times, then I can take the root of a negative number, because I'll have this negative at the end that flips everything back negative. So I can take the 5th root of a negative number, or the 9th root, or the 7th root. I cannot take the square root, or the 4th root, or the 6th root. Okay, so that's the end of Chapter 7 notes. If you have questions, let me know. All right, email me. Yeah, I will be happy to answer any questions about the notes or the homework. All right, see you guys later.